this short presentation discusses Constructivism, which is the most long-lived and most profound modernist movement in South America, specifically in Brazil, but also in Argentina and Uruguay, as we will see. Constructivism really takes its name and its spirit from the idea that art is about construction. It's more like architecture than it is about simply making images, and especially images that fool the eye or images that are supposed to illustrate some aspect of reality. What you want to do with constructivism is focus on the idea that the image, the sculpture, the object is a constructed object. It's a constructed piece of material that has to obey the same laws and serve many of the same functions as other constructed objects or constructed containers for space, which is, of course, in the latter instance where it starts to shade in to architecture. We see in this first slide a pretty typical constructivist set of objects from the late 1940s. In fact, the slide or the image on your right is Juan Bai Madi composition from 1950. So at the very end of this time, and during the explosion of art making in South America, immediately following on the Second World War, which for Europe was devastating, but which for South America actually had some economic and cultural advantages. They received a lot of immigrants, a lot of people fleeing Europe, and they were also highly productive when Europe was not, especially in terms of agriculture. So it makes a lot of sense that people in Argentina, for example, and these two, D.E. Lan on the left and Juan Bay, B-A-Y, like Bay on your right, are both Argentine artists. The D.E. Lan with roots in Europe. And the idea is that painting has become the frame in many ways, or the rectangular frame, the window space, through which we would glimpse some sort of illustrated other world, as we do in the contemporary surrealism and other movements that we've been looking at in the 1950s, is not the case here. What they really want you to think about is the constructed nature of the painted object itself. With both Lan and Bai, there's little or no attempt to represent something inside of the frame. With Lan on your left, and that's L-A-A-N, with D.E. Lan on your left, what you really have is the frame given to you as the object, and this sort of witty play on the idea of frame, picture frame, window through which you are seeing something illustrated, as opposed to here in constructivism, you're looking at the constructed nature of the frame itself is not lost, or was not lost on a lot of viewers at this time. The person who brought this to South America and cultivated really and nurtured it throughout the 30s so that it could be ready to explode in the 40s was a man named Joaquin Torres Garcia, T-O-R-R-E-S hyphen G-A-R-C-I-A. Torres Garcia was an artist who had studied in Paris and worked with people who had already a constructivist take on the art-making process in the 1920s. And he was able to bring this and several associated ideas in Europe back home to South America when he went back to Uruguay, which is where he was from, in the 30s. And he really brought this entirely different way of thinking about art, seeded it throughout South America, nurtured these seeds, and especially in his native Uruguay, and eventually it became one of the master ways, one of the most important ways to think about making art. Now, what you see on your right here is an interesting set of handmade toys that Torres Garcia and his associates made in his atelier or in his workshop. And this is pretty typical of constructivism as well. If the nature of art is really about constructing things, objects, then the objects constructed do not necessarily have to be what everyone calls high art. They could be something more useful or more functional in the traditional sense, or in the commonsensical way of looking at things, and toys for children, these sorts of other designed objects that may have a more functional use, or may have a more functional practice in the real world, is something that the constructivists were very, very interested in. And in this, they were like similar movements in Europe in the 20s and 30s, especially the Bauhaus in Germany, in which the artist practitioner wanted to break down the walls between making fine art and the poetics of making fine art and the design of everyday objects and spaces. When Torres Garcia or his confederates did get down to making objects, and this is a Torres Garcia work here in the 40s and 50s, he would inevitably use the grid. The grid was very important to all constructivists, but Torres Garcia in particular, in that it gave a rational and harmonious structure to what was what could be the perilous world of the two-dimensional flat space. And inside of this space, Torres Garcia would place, or inside of this illusionistic two-dimensional space, Torres Garcia would often place either geometric objects or very, very clearly constructed representations or images that look like sort of constructivist objects. And he would align these and order these in clearly geometric, harmonious ways. This is to play up, again, this idea that even when he's painting a two-dimensional object, it looks as if it's this sort of box in which, a container for the constructed object. His masterpiece is really a monument in a public park in Montevideo, Uruguay, which is where he was working in the late 30s. And this is the Cosmic Monument from 1938. The Cosmic Monument from the Parque Rodó, R-O-D-O, from 1938 by Joaquin Torres Garcia. And Torres Garcia here is again led by or structured by the grid, and inside of this grid he places all of these constructed objects and really even more signs. I mean, this is something that we didn't talk about in the earlier gridded painting, but here in this incised, fairly flat sculptural monument, we have things that really look almost like hieroglyphics, or like signs that are used to describe simple objects and their relations. And this is pretty typical of his strategy, again, for filling this gridded space. Without going into the meaning of the individual signs and their relations themselves, and in fact, there's no clear-cut dictionary for the meanings of Torres Garcia's placements there. It's pretty clear that the idea of this rectangular gate-like monument was taken from a particularly important indigenous monument, pre-Columbian monument from the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, adjacent to Uruguay, and that is the Gate of the Sun in Tiwanaku, Bolivia. This was a well-known pre-Columbian monument, and it's the sort of precision of the workmanship and the idea that there were these monumental, very geometric, very reduced constructions in the pre-Columbian era in this area would have, or did, in fact, appeal to Torres Garcia's sensibilities. Now, although he is referring to pre-Columbian art here, Torres Garcia is not a practitioner of the traditional current of indigenismo, or indigenous looking, indigenous referring art. And there was plenty of that going on in South America. José Sabogal on your right, painting of a Inca peasant, and Almautua, which was a well-known journal of the time, which published a lot of indigenous-leaning or indigenous interest articles, are two things that one can cite for this period. In South America, this is not Mexico, but in South America, where indigenismo was a viable current. Now, what, of course, Torres Garcia is doing here is not attempting to romanticize or attempting to make a sort of almost folkloric art. He's really talking about structuring things in ways like the constructivism had always been interested in, constructing things in ways that he also found, or that he found in parallel in the pre-Columbian tradition in this area. But he had little or no interest in reviving an entire full-blown indigenous type art or poetics. So returning to the Parque Rodó here and to the Cosmic Monument from 1938, we see that Torres Garcia was really interested in making South America modern via constructivism, and this is questioning the frame, questioning the status of the object, questioning the function of art, or the place, the role of the artist. Does she make only fine art? Of course, Torres Garcia would argue against that. He viewed his workshops, his taller, it was something that could make well-designed objects that were more functional as well. He really did not see how one could maintain such a clear divide between those two things. So constructivism becomes the foundation on which a lot of South American modernism then will spring to life from in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s and even into the 60s. Now, this was a very different situation than we have seen in Mexico, for example, that had the foundation really of Mexican muralism and the strongly narrative quality of that, and the very, very engaged politics that went along with the Mexican muralist movement and the Mexican Revolution. While in South America, you have all of those things, and you certainly have a lot of artists who know what is going on in Mexico, but you also have this very strong constructivist strain, really what becomes the dominant strain in South America, which makes these two areas, Mexico and South America, develop rather differently over the course of the 40s and 50s.